There's a moment, and if you've lived long enough on the frontier, you know exactly the kind I mean, where the world goes so quiet that your own heartbeat sounds like a confession. I've witnessed men do terrible things for land. I've seen them do worse for water. But I never expected to stand in the middle of a dusty auction yard in the New Mexico territory, watching a hooded woman get sold for $1 and feel the ground shift beneath my boots like something sacred had just been broken. Her hands weren't bound. That's the detail that stayed with me longest. She stood there perfectly still, hood pulled low with her hands folded in front of her like she was waiting for Sunday service. Not trembling, not fighting, just present. In that particular way that some people are present when they've already made peace with whatever comes next. The man who bought her was a rancher named Caleb Doss. I knew him the way you know weather, by reputation, and by the damage he left behind. I didn't know it then, but what happened in the 3 weeks after that auction would rewrite everything. I thought I understood about belonging, about blood, about what it costs a human being to protect the thing they love most. I keep a log, always have. Old habit from my surveying days, I write down what I see before I decide what to think about it. What follows is what I saw. Make of it what you will. That's why I was there. Carson Briggs, land surveyor, occasional record keeper for the territorial government, and a man with a lifelong inability to mind his own business. I'd ridden into the town of Solano Flats that morning to verify a boundary dispute between two ranching families, and the auction was running alongside the land office proceedings like it always did: livestock, tools, sometimes land parcels, occasionally debts paid in goods when coin was short. I had my leather journal tucked under my arm and a pencil behind my ear, and absolutely no intention of getting involved in anything. The woman appeared between a horse auction and the sale of a broken-down thresher. She was brought forward by a man I didn't recognize, heavyset, with the kind of sunburn that suggested he'd recently arrived from somewhere with more shade. He had her by the elbow, gently enough that it almost looked polite, and she walked steadily, which confused me more than anything. The hood was coarse brown linen, the kind you'd use to bag grain. It was tied at the throat with a leather cord. Her dress beneath it was plain, gray cotton, long-sleeved despite the August heat, and she was wearing moccasins. That detail broke through the background noise of the auction yard and grabbed me by the collar. Moccasins. The auctioneer, a wiry little man named Hutchins who had a habit of clicking his tongue between sentences, didn't waste much time on ceremony. "One woman," he said. "Terms of sale, $1 clean transfer, no inquiry. Click, bidding opens." The yard went odd. Not quiet. There were maybe 40 people around, and they kept talking. But there was a shift in the quality of the noise, the way a room changes when someone says something that everyone pretends not to hear. Caleb Doss was standing to my left. He was a big man, late 40s, with a jaw like a fence post and hands that had broken more things than they'd built. He ran the Doss ranch out past the Cimarron, nearly 4,000 acres, beef cattle, a small orchard, and a reputation for paying his hands late and his debts later. He wasn't a cruel man by the standard measures of cruelty out here. He wasn't a kind one either. He existed in that wide gray middle ground where most men on the frontier lived, practical, self-interested, capable of decency when decency cost him nothing. He raised his hand, $1. Nobody else bid. I wrote it down. I don't know why. Force of habit, I suppose. One hooded woman sold $1, Caleb Doss, Solano Flats, August 14th. I stared at what I'd written for a moment and then closed the journal because looking at it made something uncomfortable settle into my chest. Doss paid the dollar without expression, took the woman by the arm the same way the heavyset man had, not rough, not gentle, just transactional, and led her toward the hitching post where his horse was tied. I followed them. I want to be clear, I had no authority to follow them. I was a surveyor. My jurisdiction began and ended at property lines drawn on paper. But I followed them anyway because I have a condition. My former employer called it incurable nosiness. My mother called it a gift for trouble, and I called it the only honest thing about me. "Mr. Doss," I said. He turned. He didn't look surprised to see me, which bothered me slightly. Briggs, he knew who I was. Most people in the territory did. Government men have a way of being remembered, usually unfavorably. Don't. I'm not doing anything. You're about to ask me something that's none of your concern. I was going to ask if you needed help with your horse, I said. He studied me for a moment, then made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had tried harder. No! He turned back to untying the reins. The woman stood beside the horse. She hadn't moved or spoken. Up close, I could see the edge of her jaw beneath the hood, the angle of it high and precise. Her hands were folded again, still not trembling. "She going to keep that on?" I asked before I could stop myself. Das glanced at me sideways. "That's her choice," he said, in a tone that suggested the conversation was finished. He swung up into the saddle and reached down to help her up behind him with a kind of mechanical efficiency, like loading a supply sack. She took his hand without hesitation and swung up cleanly, not like someone who'd never been on a horse, but like someone who'd grown up with horses at a different angle than we did. They rode west, out past the water troughs and the edge of town where the road turned to pale dust and disappeared into the heat shimmer. I stood there with my journal open and my pencil useless and my boundary dispute entirely forgotten. I rode after them. I should explain something about the Das Ranch before I explain what I found there. Caleb Das had a daughter. Her name was Elsa. She was 15 and she was dying. I didn't know this when I rode out. I learned it in pieces over the following days the way you learn most things on the frontier, not from a single direct statement, but from the accumulation of small facts that eventually weigh enough to tell you something true. I knew Elsa Das existed because I'd surveyed the ranch property 2 years earlier, and she'd brought me water without being asked, which I'd noted in my journal under small, unremarkable kindnesses. I hadn't seen her since. The ranch sat in a shallow valley between two ridges, with a creek running through it that was doing its summer best to disappear entirely. The main house was solid, Das had built well, with a covered porch and a garden that someone was maintaining carefully. There were outbuildings, a bunkhouse where 3 or 4 hands lived, and a barn with the kind of structural integrity that told you the man cared more about his animals' shelter than his own. I rode up to the gate and called out. Das appeared on the porch with his rifle in the cradle of his arm, which was less threatening than it sounds. Out here, appearing with your rifle in the cradle of your arm was roughly equivalent to appearing with your hands in your pockets. It was a posture, not an escalation. "Briggs," he said, flat. "I need to verify the northern boundary markers," I said, which was true enough. The dispute I'd been sent for involved the ridge to the north of his property. "I'll need access." He regarded me for a long moment. Behind him, through the open door, I could see lamplight even though it was midday, which meant the curtains were drawn, which meant someone inside preferred the dark or needed it. "2 days," he said. "You can make camp by the creek. Don't come in the house." "Appreciate it," I said. He went back inside. I made camp by the creek and spent the afternoon pretending to survey property lines and actually watching the house. The woman in the hood came out in the late afternoon. She'd removed it. I was too far to see her face clearly from the creek, but I could see enough, the straight black hair, the way she moved through the garden with a purposefulness that was different from hurry, stopping at each plant with what looked like genuine assessment rather than casual maintenance. She had something in her hands, a bundle of something, dried stems or roots, and she handled them with the care you give to things that took a long time to grow. She was Apache. I was certain of it the moment I saw the way she moved, the same fluid economy of motion I'd seen in the Apache women I'd encountered near the reservation at Bosque Redondo before it collapsed. A quality of attention to the physical world that most of us had trained ourselves out of by the time we were adults. I wrote it down and then sat with what I'd written. One Apache woman, sold for $1, living at the Das Ranch. Caleb Das, whose daughter was apparently bedridden in a darkened room. I am not, by nature, a man who makes large, intuitive leaps, but some things assemble themselves whether you invite them to or not. The next morning, one of the ranch hands, a young Mexican man named Tomás, who had the comfortable chattiness of someone who spent too many hours alone, found me at the creek and sat down without invitation to watch me pretend to measure things. "You the government man?" he asked. "Surveyor," I said. "Same thing." He picked up a flat stone and turned it over in his fingers. "You see the woman. The one Mr. Das brought back yesterday." Tomás nodded slowly. "She was here before," he said. 2, maybe 3 years ago, different time." He paused, organizing his English. Elsa used to play out by the north fence sometimes. Apache girl would come, same one, I think maybe her sister, and they'd sit. Kids, you know how kids are. Didn't need words. What happened? Reservation, he said, the word landing like a stone dropped in still water. Then Elsa got sick. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. What's wrong with her? I asked. Lungs, he said, the cough, sickness. He touched his own chest briefly, then stood and dusted off his trousers. Mr. Das went to every doctor between here and Santa Fe. They all said the same thing. He paused. Then somebody told him about medicine women. He walked back toward the barn without another word. I sat by the creek for a long time after that, listening to the water make its thin, struggling sound over the rocks. And I thought about a man standing in an auction yard holding a dollar coin and bidding on a woman in a hood. And I thought about what kind of desperation makes that make sense. And I thought about how desperation rarely makes anything make sense. But we reach for it anyway because the alternative is standing still while something precious dies. I wrote in my journal, the hood was her choice. He said so. Why would it be her choice? I didn't have an answer, but the question settled in me like it intended to stay. On the second evening, just before dusk, I did the thing I'd been not doing for 2 days and walked up to the house. Das was on the porch. He watched me come without the rifle this time, which I chose to interpret as progress. Boundary markers are where they should be, I said. I'll file the report. Good. I should have left. I am constitutionally incapable of doing what I should. The woman, I said, is she here voluntarily? Das was quiet for a long moment. He had a way of being quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of a man who believed words had weight and didn't spend them carelessly. I'd met very few people like that. I generally found them either admirable or terrifying, sometimes both. She came to me, he said finally. 3 weeks before the auction, came to the ranch gate, asked for Elsa by name. He paused. I didn't recognize her at first. Couldn't think how she'd know Elsa's name till Tamaz told me about the fence and the years before. Another pause. She'd heard about Elsa somehow. Word travels in ways I don't understand. She came to help. She came to try. Something moved across his face, not quite grief, not quite gratitude, something with the texture of both. She said she knew what was wrong, said she'd seen it before, said she could do something. I didn't believe her. But Elsa was already so far gone the doctors had stopped making predictions. He looked out over the darkening yard. A man with nothing left to lose has a low threshold for belief. I thought about the auction, about the dollar, about the hood. The auction, I said, the hood. Why? Das was quiet for longer this time. She's Apache, he said, as though that explained everything. And in the territory in 1887 it very nearly did. She came onto my property voluntarily. She had no papers, no documentation, no way to prove she wasn't a runaway or a he stopped, reorganized. If she'd been seen here, living here, people would have asked questions I couldn't answer in ways that kept her safe. He met my eyes. The hood was her idea. She said, make it legal, put it on paper. $1, clean transfer. Then on paper she belongs to the ranch, and the ranch has a right to keep her here, and nobody can pull her out from under that without a legal fight. I stood very still. She designed her own sale, I said. She designed her own protection, he said. There's a difference. There was a significant one. And yet standing there in the pale dusk with the ranch dog asleep on the bottom porch step and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night, I found I couldn't organize my feelings about it into anything clean or simple. I opened my journal. I didn't know what to write. I closed it again. Is it working? I asked. Whatever she's doing for Elsa. Das looked at his hands for a moment, those big, ungentle hands. And then he looked up, and something in his face was so raw and undefended that I had to look away. Come back in 2 weeks, he said. I'll know more by then. I rode back to my camp in the full dark, and I wrote in my journal for a long time, and none of what I wrote was about property lines. I came back in 2 weeks. I told myself I came back because of the boundary dispute. There was a secondary marker on the eastern ridge that wanted verification. I told my supervisor in a formal report that I had returned to complete a thorough property assessment. I told Tamaz, who was waiting at the creek as though he'd expected me, that I had unfinished business. He handed me a tin cup of coffee without comment. It was the best coffee I'd had in 6 weeks. She's still here, he said. I didn't ask. No, but, he shrugged in that expressive way he had. You would have. He was right, I would have. The ranch felt different. That's the first thing I noticed, and the thing I struggled longest to explain in my journal, because different is not a surveyor's word. Surveyors deal in measurements and facts and reproducible observations. But there was something in the quality of the air around the Doss property that had shifted in 2 weeks, something I can only describe as the difference between a held breath and a slow exhale. The garden was significantly larger. Someone had extended it along the south fence, adding a new section with plants I didn't immediately recognize, low, spreading things with small dark leaves that I later identified, after much research, as plants with no common English names. Things from a different taxonomy than mine. A fire pit had appeared near the eastern wall of the house, ringed carefully with flat stones, with a low wooden frame over it that held something suspended in a ceramic pot. The smell that came from it was complex and not unpleasant, something green and something sharp, and something sweet underneath both. She was there, standing at the fire pit, adjusting something, her back to me. She'd traded the gray dress for something more her own, still practical, still frontier functional, but with beadwork at the sleeves that hadn't been there before. Doss, or someone, had given her room to be more herself, and she had taken it quietly without announcement. I tied my horse and stood at a respectful distance and waited, which is not my natural mode of operation, but which felt correct. After a moment she turned. She was younger than I'd expected. Maybe 25, maybe a handful of years either side. She had a face that was composed in the way that faces get when their owners have learned that the world reads expressions like a map, and that privacy sometimes requires keeping that map folded. Her eyes were dark and direct, and they assessed me with the same focused attention she gave the plants in the garden. "The man who writes things down," she said. Her English was precise, with an architecture I recognized, the English of someone who'd learned it as a practical tool and used it without affectation. "Carson Briggs," I said, "surveyor." "I know who you are," she turned back to the pot. "Tamaz talks." "He does," I agreed. A silence that wasn't unfriendly. "How is she?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, not Doss's weighted quiet, but the quiet of someone measuring how much of a truth to offer. "Breathing better," she said finally. "The infection in her lungs is still there. It takes time." A pause. "More time than some infections, less than others." "But you think—" "I think," she said carefully, "that what I know is worth more than what I don't know, and I also know that what I know may not be enough." She looked at me then, directly. "Both things are true at the same time. Does that make sense to you?" "Yes," I said, more than she probably realized. She didn't offer her name. I didn't ask for it. That would come later and from her on her terms. I was beginning to understand that everything here operated on her terms in the ways that mattered. The auction, the hood, the legal paper, those had been the world's terms, the territory's terms, the terms of a landscape that would not accommodate her otherwise. But within those terms, she'd built something. I made camp again by the creek, and this time I stayed for 5 days. I told myself it was the Eastern marker. There were legitimate measurements to take. I have told myself many things in my life that were true in the way that half-truths are true, which is to say technically but not essentially. In those 5 days, I observed the following. She rose before dawn every morning. I know this because I also rise before dawn, an old habit from my surveying days, when the light is best and the shadows tell you the most. And each morning when I walked up toward the house to collect water from the pump, I would see the fire already going, small and controlled, and her already there beside it. Elsa Doss had a window that faced east. On 3 of those 5 mornings, the curtains were open. I could see a pale shape inside, sitting, not lying, sitting up. Doss himself had changed in a way I found harder to measure than property lines. He moved around the ranch with the same efficiency as before, but something in the set of his shoulders was different. Not relaxed exactly. Caleb Doss didn't seem like a man built for relaxation, but less braced. Less like a man waiting to absorb a blow. On the 3rd day, she asked me if I wanted to see what she was doing. I said yes before I finished processing that she'd asked. The room they'd given her was the small one off the kitchen, a room that had probably been used for storage, with a narrow window that got the afternoon light. She'd made it her own in the way of people who understand that permanence is not always the point. There were bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters, arranged in a system I couldn't decode at a glance. There were 2 ceramic bowls and 1 tin pot she'd acquired somewhere. There was a folded blanket on the floor mat that served as her bed, and on the blanket, a small carved wooden figure I couldn't make out clearly without staring too long. Against the wall, a row of paper packets, twisted newspaper, each labeled in a careful script I didn't recognize. "This is what I use for the steam," she said, lifting one packet and untwisting it to show me the contents, dried leaves and something that looked like small seed pods. "She breathes it twice a day. It opens what the infection closes. Like a vapor treatment." "Your doctors do vapor treatments," she agreed, with a slight inflection that wasn't quite dismissive but was definitely precise. "Their vapors are eucalyptus and camphor. These are different, older. Do you know the difference in how they work?" She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read. "My grandmother knew," she said. "I learned from my grandmother." She learned from her grandmother. She set the packet down carefully. "I understand what it does. I understand that it works. The mechanism," she paused on the word, testing its weight, "I cannot explain in the way your books would want." "That's more honest than most of my colleagues' explanations of anything," I said. Something shifted briefly in her composed expression. It might have been a near smile. "You can come see her tomorrow," she said. "Elsa wants to meet the man who writes things down. She saw you from the window." Elsa Doss was 15 and had the particular beauty of very ill people, something luminous and close to the surface that health tends to bury under ordinary living. She was propped up with pillows in her narrow bed, and the room smelled of those complex green steam treatments, and there was a cup of something on the bedside table that she wrinkled her nose at when I looked at it. "It tastes like the creek," she said, "after rain." "Is that bad?" "I've tasted worse." She looked at me with bright, assessing eyes. Her color was not good, but it was better than I'd expected. Better, something in me noted, than a person with active severe lung infection should look. She said, "You write everything down." "It's a habit," I said. "Write this down." She adjusted herself against the pillows, a small, careful movement that told me how much that cost her. "She sat with me for 3 nights straight when I first got really bad, didn't sleep. Just sat there and changed the bowls and talked to me." A pause. "She talked in Apache. I don't understand Apache. But it helped." She looked at her hands, folded on the blanket, young hands with the unself-conscious gesture I'd seen before. "I don't know why. Maybe it was just that someone was there. Maybe it was the sound." She looked up at me. "Write that down, that it helped even without the words." I wrote it down. She watched me do it with a satisfaction that reminded me she was 15. And 15-year-olds have a particular investment in being documented correctly. "Is she going to stay?" Elsa asked. "After?" "I don't know," I said. "Dad doesn't know either, I can tell." She coughed, a deep, wet sound that was frightening, and then subsided. "He bought her," she said when she'd recovered. "Like a thing." She paused. "She let him. Why would she let him?" I thought about what Das had told me on the porch that first evening. "Because sometimes the only way to be allowed to do something good," I said slowly, "is to play by rules that aren't good." Elsa thought about this for a long moment with the serious gravity of someone who is very ill and therefore has a different relationship to large ideas than the rest of us. "That's awful," she said. "Yes," I said. "Write that down too," she said, "that it's awful." I wrote it down. On the 5th day, I found her at the north fence, the same fence Tamaz had described, where Elsa had sat as a child. She was standing with her arms resting on the top rail, looking north toward the ridge, and she had the stillness of someone who'd come there on purpose. I stood beside her without speaking. After a while she said, "My name is Tukumit." "Tukumit," I repeated. "What does it mean?" "It means woman who carries things over long distances," she said. "My grandmother's name was the same." "She named you after herself." "She named me after what she hoped I'd be." A pause. "I'm not sure I've earned it yet." I looked at the garden she'd extended, at the fire pit, at the paper packets of medicine, at the window where Elsa sat up instead of lying down. "I'd argue differently," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Elsa's grandmother was Apache. Did you know that?" I hadn't known. I wrote nothing. I had no journal. Just felt the information rearrange everything I thought I understood about Caleb Doss and why he'd bid that dollar. His wife, she said, she died when Elsa was born. He doesn't talk about it. She ran her thumb along the top rail of the fence. Elsa has her grandmother's cheekbones. I saw it the first time she came to this fence. I was 11, she was 7. She paused. I remembered her when I heard she was sick. I remembered those cheekbones. And you came. And I came, simple, absolute. Even knowing what it would cost you, I said. The auction, the paper, the all of it. Elsa isn't what it cost me, she said. Elsa is what I came for. She straightened from the fence and walked back toward the house without looking back. And I stood at the north fence where 2 children had once sat without needing words, and I looked north at the ridge, and I thought about what it means to carry something over long distances. That evening, Doss found me at the creek packing up my camp. You're leaving, he said. I should have left 3 days ago, I said. He crouched down beside the creek and picked up a stone and held it the way Tamaz had, turning it over. She told me, he said, when she first came, about Elsa's grandmother. He turned the stone. I knew she was Apache, my wife. She didn't always talk about where she came from, and I didn't always ask the right questions. He paused. I've spent 11 years thinking about the questions I didn't ask. I kept packing. She told me something else, he said. She said that what Elsa has, the lung sickness, her people have seen more of it in the years at the reservation. Said she'd lost 2 cousins to it. Said she'd been trying to understand it for 3 years. He set the stone down. She wasn't just coming to help a child she remembered. She was coming because she'd been working on this for 3 years and she needed a patient who was still strong enough to try. I stopped packing. Elsa helped her too, I said. Yes, he stood. The word had weight. And the dollar, I said. The auction. He looked at me. She proposed it. I told her it was wrong. She said wrong has a price and right has a price, and the only question is which price you can survive paying. He paused. She said the paper would protect her, and Elsa. Another pause. And it has. I finished packing. I'm going to write a report, I said, to the territorial government, the boundary dispute. He said nothing. The report will note that the Doss Ranch is operating normally and is in compliance with all boundary agreements, I said, and that I observed nothing unusual in my survey. The silence between us had a particular texture. Briggs, he said finally. I should be back through in 6 weeks, I said. If there are any further disputes. I rode east without looking back, and I kept my journal open on my knee as I rode, and I wrote down everything, because I had promised a 15-year-old girl with her grandmother's cheekbones that I would. 6 weeks is a long time when you're waiting to know if something worked. I know this the way I know most things, by living through it, by the way it altered the texture of ordinary days. I went back to my regular work, marking boundaries, filing reports, riding out to places where the land was in dispute and measuring the distances between what people claimed and what the ground actually said. Normal work, necessary work. I kept thinking about Tukumit at the north fence. I kept thinking about Elsa saying, write that down, that it helped even without the words. I kept my journal open every evening, and I wrote down things I'd seen that day. And somewhere in the writing, I'd find myself drifting back to Solano Flats, to the auction yard, to the woman in the hood who had designed her own sale with the precision of someone who understood exactly which boxes the territory required you to check. I've thought about this many times since, and I always arrive at the same place. There is a particular kind of intelligence that operates below the threshold of what the dominant world will recognize as intelligence. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't write books or argue in courts or draw maps. It works in different registers, through relationship, through observation, through the accumulated weight of knowledge, passed grandmother to granddaughter over generations long enough that the origin disappears into something that just looks, to an outsider, like instinct. I was trained to measure the physical world with instruments designed by people who looked like me, speaking languages like mine, with frameworks built by my kind of mind. And I had just spent 5 days watching someone save a child's life with tools that my instruments couldn't touch. I wrote that down too, right there in my government-issued journal between a boundary assessment and a topographical note. There are kinds of knowing that our measurements cannot reach. This is not an argument against measurement. It is an argument for humility about what measuring can do. My supervisor would have found that insufficiently professional. He would have been right. I left it in. I was back at the Doss Ranch in 7 weeks rather than 6, because I was delayed by a dispute outside Cimarron that turned out to be more complicated than the paperwork suggested. They always are. I arrived in the late afternoon. The first thing I saw was Elsa Doss sitting on the porch. Sitting on the porch, outside in the afternoon sun, with a book open in her lap and a glass of something on the railing beside her, and the complete unremarkable ordinariness of a young person enjoying an afternoon, which was so far from what I'd last seen of her, propped on pillows, breathing carefully, the room full of green-smelling steam, that I had to stop my horse and look for a moment before I was sure. She looked up and saw me. "Write it down," she called from across the yard. 15 years old, perfectly certain, slightly imperious. I pulled out my journal. "Writing it down," I called back. She went back to her book. Doss came out as I was tying my horse. He looked like a man who had been through something large and come out on the other side, which is different from looking like a man who has not been through anything. There's a weight that stays even when the fear has gone, not grief exactly, but the memory of where grief had been. He moved with it, this new weight, and it didn't slow him down, but it made him more deliberate. "She's better," I said, because it was obvious and I needed to say it anyway. "She's better," he agreed. He looked at Elsa on the porch, a look I tried not to intrude on, brief and fierce and quiet. "3 weeks ago she walked to the creek and back on her own." He paused. "Tukumit went with her 20 feet behind, not helping, said she needed to do it herself." "She did." "She did," he almost smiled. Almost it stopped just short, became something more restrained and more real than a smile. Coughed the whole way back, sat down on the porch and coughed for 10 minutes. Then looked at Tukumit and said, "Tomorrow we go farther." I thought about Elsa's grandmother's cheekbones, about what gets passed through blood and what gets passed through memory and what the difference is between the two. "Where is Tukumit?" I asked. His expression changed, a small, careful shift. "That's why I'm glad you're here," he said. She was in the garden. The extended garden, now larger still, running the full length of the south fence, with the additional section along the east wall that hadn't been there on my last visit. She was kneeling in the dirt with her hands deep in the soil and her attention entirely on what she was doing, and she heard me coming and looked up without startlement. "The government man," she said. "The boundary surveyor," I said. "Nothing official." She sat back on her heels and brushed soil from her hands. She looked different was the wrong word, but changed in some essential calibration. Still composed, still that folded map quality of face, but something beneath it was less tightly maintained, like she'd allowed herself to not be holding herself quite so carefully. "Elsa is well," she said. "I saw her on the porch." "She'll still have bad days," she said. "The infection doesn't leave all at once, it retreats, but it retreats." She looked at her hands. "By winter she should be mostly whole." Mostly whole. I wrote it in my head and knew I'd write it later. "And you?" I asked. A pause. "I've been thinking about leaving," she said. It wasn't a surprise. I'd been waiting for it in the way you wait for something that makes sense, but you wish made different sense. "The paper," I said. "The sale, that still." "Caleb found a lawyer in Santa Fe," she said. "The paper can be undone. He found a way to document it as a," she searched for the word, "a labor contract, terminated by mutual agreement. I would have documentation, a record of legitimate employment on the ranch." She paused. "His lawyer says it would be sufficient in most practical circumstances." "Most practical circumstances," I said. The language of the frontier, where legal reality and lived reality maintained a careful distance from each other. "I have family," she said. "North of here by 3 days, my sister and her husband, a community." She looked toward the ridge. "I've been away from them for 4 months." "But you're not sure," I said. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting in her lap, soiled dark at the edges of her palms. "Elsa asked me to stay," she said. 2 nights ago, she asked me directly. She said, a pause in which she was clearly deciding how much to share. She said, "You're the only person who talks to me like I'm going to be here in 10 years. I felt that sentence land somewhere it wasn't supposed to reach. "She is going to be here in 10 years, I said. Yes, simple, then, but she didn't know that before I came, and knowing that changes something in a person. She looked at me directly. I told her I didn't know, that was honest. I didn't know when I came here that I would. She stopped, reorganized. I thought I was coming for a few weeks, to help with what I could and then leave. And now Elsa is on the porch reading a book, she said, and Caleb planted 2 rows of the medicine plants without being asked, because he watched me tend them until he understood, and Tamaz is learning the names in Apache, which makes them sound right in a way they don't sound in English. And she stopped again. And I planted things that won't be ready to harvest until next spring. I looked at the garden. She looked at the garden. That might be your answer, I said. Or it might be the answer I let myself give without thinking it through, she said. Can it be both? I asked. She considered this. Yes, she said, finally. It can be both. I had dinner with them that evening, all of them together. Das at the head of the table, Elsa across from Tukumit, Tamaz bringing in the bread with the satisfaction of someone who has made the bread himself, which he had. It was an ordinary dinner in the way that things are ordinary only in retrospect. Only once you know they'll become one of those meals you carry around in your memory for decades as an example of something you can't quite name. Elsa told a long, complicated story about a rabbit that had gotten into the garden and the unsuccessful campaign she'd conducted from the window to deter it. Tukumit listened with her full attention, that focused, complete attention, and offered at the end that there were ways to discourage rabbits that did not involve throwing a boot, which had apparently been part of Elsa's strategy. The boot didn't connect, Elsa said with dignity. I know, said Tukumit, the rabbit is still there. Das made a sound that was unambiguously a laugh. I wrote it down in my journal under the table, hiding the journal on my knee the way I used to in school when I should have been paying attention to the lesson rather than recording it. Elsa caught me and gave me an approving nod. After dinner, Tukumit and I walked out to the porch while Elsa helped Tamaz with the dishes and Das saw to the horses. The night was enormous over the Cimarron Ridge, that particular New Mexico darkness that has stars too many to count, and a quality of silence that is less absence of sound than presence of something that doesn't have a name. I have a question, I said, and you can tell me to mind my business. You won't, she said. Mind your business, but ask. When you came through the auction, when you stood there with the hood on waiting, I paused. Were you afraid? The silence that followed had a different quality than her usual measured quiet. Every moment, she said. But you were still. Being afraid and being still are not opposites, she said. Being afraid and being paralyzed, that's what fear wants. Being afraid and still moving, that's what you do when you've decided something matters more than the fear. I thought about this. Elsa, I said. Yes, she said, and other things. A pause. The knowledge my grandmother gave me, it needed to be used. Knowledge that isn't used becomes something that died twice, once when the people who lived it died and once when it stops being practiced. She looked at the stars. I needed a patient. Elsa needed medicine. Both things were true at the same time. You said that before, I said. Both things being true at the same time. It's something I believe very strongly, she said. That the world is not made of one truth or another. It is made of many truths that exist together and sometimes pull against each other. She paused. Most of the trouble in the territory comes from people who can only hold one truth at a time. I thought about the auction yard, about the dollar, about the hood that was her choice, about the legal paper that was a cage and a shelter at once. Are you going to stay? I asked. She was quiet for so long that the question began to dissolve in the night air. I planted things that won't be ready until spring, she said finally, and did not say anything else. I left the next morning before dawn. Das was already up. I could see the lamplight in the barn, and I didn't disturb him. Tamaz was asleep. Elsa was asleep. Tukumit was at the fire pit. She handed me a small paper packet without speaking, twisted newspaper like the ones in her room. Labeled in her script, which I could read now, after 5 days and 7 weeks and an evening dinner, though it had taken time. The label read, for when the cold comes and the chest tightens. A gift, she said, for traveling. Thank you, I said, and meant it in more ways than I could organize into words before dawn. I tied the packet to my saddle pack and mounted up and turned east. Briggs, she said. I looked back. She was standing at the fire with the dawn beginning behind the ridge and the garden extending along the south fence and the house quiet behind her. And she looked like someone who had traveled a very long distance carrying something heavy and had set it down, finally, somewhere that would hold it. "Write it down accurately," she said, "all of it. Not just the parts that look the way people expect." "I always do," I said. "I know," she said, "that's why I'm asking. I have been writing ever since." I filed my survey report. It noted boundary compliance and nothing unusual, technically accurate. In my personal journal, the one nobody official ever reads, I wrote everything. The auction, the dollar, the hood and the decision inside it, the paper that was both wrong and right at once, the rabbit that got away with the garden, the dinner table, Elsa's grandmother's cheekbones and the knowledge that traveled from one woman's hands to another's across a fence and 20 years and everything the territory had done to make that transfer impossible. I went back twice more that year. By the second visit, Elsa was walking to the creek and back without stopping. By the third, she was riding. By the third visit, there were 2 new plants in the garden I didn't recognize. Tukumit explained them to me in precise, careful English and also in the Apache names, which she said were the right names, the names that understood what the plants were for. I wrote both sets of names down. On the last evening of my last visit that year, I sat with Elsa on the porch while the others were inside, and she asked me something I've thought about since. "Do you think she'll be here in 10 years?" she asked. She meant Tukumit. I looked at the garden along the south fence, green and deliberate, growing things that wouldn't be ready until spring. I looked at the fire pit with its careful ring of stones, the wooden frame, the ceramic pot. I looked at the north fence in the distance, where 2 children had once sat without needing words. "I think," I said, "she'll be here until she decides she's finished with what she came for." "And when will that be?" Elsa asked. I didn't answer. I thought about what Tukumit had said on the porch, both things being true at the same time, and I thought about medicine that takes time and knowledge that needs a patient and a girl on a porch reading a book, and a man planting rows without being asked because he watched long enough to understand. "What do you think?" I asked instead. Elsa looked at the garden. "I think," she said slowly, "that she didn't come here to leave." The creek made its thin sound in the distance.